Deep in the rolling hills of central Virginia, there's a farm that quietly vanished from county records around 1871. The land itself is still there, hidden away if you know where to look. But the official documents that once named it were deliberately removed from courthouse ledgers, and no one has ever explained why. If you ask the old-timers in the area and catch them in the right mood, they'll tell you the strange events began the summer the well was drained. That well had been there for nearly 2 centuries. Dug and lined with stone, it plunged 30 feet into the red Virginia soil. Generations had drawn water from it without incident. When the latest owners decided the well had finally gone dry, they hired 4 men to pump it out and seal it permanently. The crew arrived on a Monday. By Tuesday evening, 2 had quit. By Wednesday, the other 2 had left the county entirely. A 5th man was eventually persuaded to climb down and see what they'd found. He returned to the surface in under 10 minutes, climbed into his wagon, and drove off without collecting his pay. No official record was ever made of what lay at the bottom. But a private letter, later discovered among the estate papers of a Lynchburg attorney, mentioned something striking: the space below hadn't been carved by water. It had been built. Before we go any further into the story of the Vawses farm and what lay beneath it, if you're new here, welcome to Liturgy of Fear. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. And drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience is tuning in, because the story of what was built at the bottom of that well, who built it, and why it had to be sealed and forgotten, stretches back far beyond the farm itself. It begins with a war most people have stopped talking about, and it ends with a secret that 3 families spent decades trying to bury. To understand what was found beneath the Vawses land, you have to understand what that part of Virginia was like before the Civil War, and what it became afterward. The hill country west of Lynchburg wasn't plantation country in the tidewater sense. The farms were smaller, the land rocky and broken, unsuited for large-scale tobacco farming. What the hill farmers had instead was a fierce self-sufficiency and a deep suspicion of outsiders. The Vawses had been on their land since the 1680s. Originally Welsh, they'd arrived with a small group of settlers and slowly pushed inland, away from the coast and towns, until they found a hollow between 2 ridges that felt right. They built a stone house there, dug a well, cleared timber, and settled in. By the Revolution, they were 3 generations deep. By the 1840s, 5. In the years that interest us, the head of the household was Nathaniel Vawses, a quiet, solid man in his mid-50s by the late 1850s. He had 2 sons, Emmett and Calhoun, both grown and working the farm. His wife, Dorothea, came from a family with strong convictions about how certain things should be done. And there was Louisa, their 17-year-old daughter, whose journal would later become the key source for everything we know about what happened on that farm. The Vawses weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor. They owned 3 enslaved people: George, Hattie, and Hattie's son, a boy of about 12 named Wren. Nathaniel had inherited this system along with the farm, the well, and the stone house. He hadn't chosen it, but he hadn't refused it either. The farm's geography was crucial. The hollow was narrow, the ridges steep, and the lone dirt road connecting the property to the county was poor in summer and nearly impassable in winter. The closest neighbor, Crockett Farley, ran a gristmill 2 miles south, close enough to call in an emergency, far enough to be invisible day to day. The Vawses were, in every real sense, their own world. The well sat in the center of the yard, between the house and barn. It was old enough that no living person remembered its construction, though family lore held that the original Welsh settlers had sunk it around 1690. Lined with dry, fitted fieldstone, it produced cold, clean water year-round. In summer, cool air rose from its depths. In winter, the stone rim was often the only thing not frosted in the yard. Louisa mentioned the well several times in her journal before the trouble began. Not because it seemed remarkable. She treated it like any other fixed landmark, a given, a familiar point around which farm life revolved. She wrote about drawing water early in the mornings, about her brother once dropping a bucket in and having to fish it out with wire. She also noted that on very still summer nights, you could sometimes hear a low, irregular sound rising from it. Like breathing, she said, though she attributed it to wind moving through rock somewhere far below. She was 17. The sound unsettled her, she admitted, but unease wasn't unusual on the Vawses farm in the summer of 1858. That was the summer everything changed. Not because of anything that happened on the farm itself, but because of an event 20 miles away. A man named Josiah Trent, who owned a larger farm near Rustburg, had been part of a carefully concealed network that had been moving enslaved people northward through the hill country for about 15 years. Trent hadn't taken on this work out of deep abolitionist conviction. He'd stumbled into it, entangled by circumstance with a Quaker merchant in Lynchburg named Caleb Drummond. Together, they'd created a quiet arrangement that, by 1858, had helped a significant number of people reach free states via a route that wound through mountain hollows and over ridges. In June of 1858, Josiah Trent was caught. The Lynchburg Virginian covered his arrest on June 14. Louisa mentions reading about it, though she doesn't say where she got the paper. The arrest sent a shockwave through every household in the hill country connected to Trent's work. The authorities knew he hadn't acted alone, and they were prepared to be patient about finding the others. Nathaniel read the newspaper report with the same expression he'd used to inspect a poorly set fence post. Dry, careful, revealing nothing. He folded the paper and burned it. 3 nights later, a stranger appeared at the Vawses' back door after midnight. Louisa heard it from her bedroom. The low knock, her father's voice, the back door opening and closing. She didn't go downstairs. The next morning, she wrote in her journal that she'd heard at least 2 other voices besides her father's, and the sound of the barn door opening and later closing. She didn't yet understand what she'd heard, but she remembered it with the kind of precision that suggests she already sensed, even at 17, that whatever was happening on her father's farm wasn't something safe to speak about. Nathaniel Vawses had been part of Trent's network for at least 4 years before the arrest. Louisa would spend years trying to reconstruct how deeply he was involved. What she eventually established was that the route through Vawses Hollow had made use of a feature of the property no surveyor had ever had reason to examine closely. The well, or more precisely, what lay below it, because the well wasn't just a well. 30 feet down, just below the water table, where the upper shaft was dark with moisture, the shaft didn't end in a clay floor. It opened, widened, and became something else entirely. Whoever had dug the original well, and the timing was critical, had gone down through the rock not just to find water, but to connect with something already there. A natural limestone fissure, running roughly north to south beneath the hollow. At some point in the distant past, someone had done deliberate work on that fissure. They'd raised the ceiling, laid a rough stone floor, shored the walls with timbers that by 1858 were beginning to fail. They'd created, 30 feet beneath the farmyard, a room that, by the time the 4 workmen were hired to drain and seal the well in 1871, had held human beings for a very long time. To understand what that room was, you have to understand how it worked. And to understand how it worked, You need to go further back than Nathaniel Vawses. Further back even than Trent's network. Central Virginia's limestone country is riddled with caves and natural passages. The famous caverns to the north are only the visible part of a much larger underground landscape, one that indigenous people knew for centuries before Europeans arrived, and that settlers kept stumbling into as they dug foundations, wells, and root cellars across the region. The Welsh settlers who came to Vawses Hollow in the 1680s were miners by tradition. Back in Wales, you learned to read the landscape for what it hid below: coal seams, lead deposits, the passages connecting them. When the man who would become Nathaniel's great-grandfather sank his well, he wasn't surprised to find the rock opening below the water line. He'd been looking for it, sounding the ground with a steel rod as he'd been taught. He found the hollow place before he ever broke the surface, and what he built down there in those early years, before the colony was established enough for such things to be anyone else's business, was a storage room, a place to keep things that wouldn't freeze in winter or spoil in summer: smoked meat, seed grain, the kind of reserves that made the difference between a hard winter and a killing one. This is documented, after a fashion, in a fragment of a letter written in Welsh, found decades later folded inside the cover of a family Bible. A scholar at a Virginia college translated it in the 1890s. He described a room below the family's water source: cool, dry, suitable for preservation, accessible only through the well shaft above. For the better part of a century, that's presumably all it was: a cold cellar with an unusually difficult entrance, used and then forgotten as the family grew and built proper above-ground storage. By the 1850s, Nathaniel Vawses, who'd known about the room since childhood, had repurposed it. In a way, his Welsh ancestor, digging into the limestone with a miner's rod and survivalist arithmetic, could never have imagined. The room below the well had become a stop on a route that moved human beings through darkness toward something that might eventually resemble light. How many people passed through during Nathaniel's years with the network can't be precisely established. Louisa eventually pieced together that the number was more than 40, possibly closer to 80. People arrived at the farm at night, were lowered through the well shaft on a rope and a board seat, spent between 1 and 4 days in the room below, and were moved on to the next point in the chain. The room had supplies, food and water kept specifically for that purpose, a lamp with enough oil for several days, and, Louisa noted, a collection of blankets her mother Dorothea had been quietly acquiring for years. Good woolen blankets, not thin ones, so that whoever came through wouldn't be cold. Dorothea Pendleton Vawses wasn't merely aware of what her husband was doing. She was an active and essential part of it. This was the part of the story the letter in the Lynchburg attorney's estate papers touched on most obliquely. The letter that described the room as having been built, not dug, because that word "built" was understood by the attorney's family to mean something very specific. The attorney, Edmund Caskey, had represented one of the families involved in the investigation following Trent's arrest. The letter had been written to him by a client who needed him to understand the nature of what they were dealing with. The room below the Vawses well had been deliberately shaped, over decades, into something people could survive in. That was simultaneously the horror and the miracle of it. Someone had taken a natural crack in the limestone 30 feet underground and made it livable. Installed the timber shoring, the plank floor, the ventilation that came from a second, narrower fissure opening on the hillside to the north, hidden behind mountain laurel. Someone had thought through what a human being would need to survive 2, 3, 4 days in the dark below the earth. That kind of sustained, Deliberate care wasn't something Nathaniel had done alone. It was the work of years, possibly of more than one generation. And it was precisely that care, the thought behind the blankets, the lamp oil, the ventilation, that disturbed the men who came to drain and seal the well in 1871. The room was empty by then, but it wasn't abandoned in the way an unused space is abandoned. It was preserved. Every object was in its place. The lamp was trimmed and had oil. The blankets were folded. On a ledge cut into the limestone sat a tin cup, and inside the cup was a folded piece of paper with a list of names. The list on that paper was what sent the fifth workman back up without collecting his pay. He could read, not well, but enough, and what he saw on that list, 30 feet underground on a Central Virginia farm in 1871, carried a weight he couldn't calculate. He left. He told his employer, a Lynchburg contractor named Silas Poor, only that the well needed to be sealed from the top, and left alone. He wouldn't discuss his reasons. Poor, a practical man who knew when a conversation was over, sealed the well and billed the estate, and said nothing further about it for several years. Poor eventually wrote the letter that ended up in Caskey's estate papers, sometime around 1876, in response to a legal inquiry Caskey was conducting on behalf of an unnamed party with an interest in the Vawses property. In it, Poor described what his workmen had seen: the room, the blankets, the lamp, the ventilation shaft, the tin cup and folded paper. He didn't reproduce the names, but he described the paper's appearance. Old, folded many times, written in at least 2 hands. The ink faded to pale brown at the top and darker, more recent toward the bottom, as if the list had been started decades earlier and added to over a long period of time. Caskey's response isn't preserved, but what is preserved in Campbell County Courthouse records, which weren't subject to the same careful editing as the records where the Vawses farm lay, is a deed transfer dated 1877. The Vawses farm changed hands for well below its market value. The purchaser was a holding company whose principals included a man named Cornelius Dabney, a member of the Virginia legislature in the 1870s. Dabney had been a county court member during the antebellum period and had been deeply invested in the investigation of Trent's network. In 1858, he hadn't found what he was looking for. The investigation had been thorough, but it never reached the Vawses farm. Nathaniel had been careful. The hollow was remote, and the people who knew about the room were either dead or silent. Trent himself never told anyone that the route went after it left his property. Almost certainly a deliberate design feature of the network. Dabney's interest, it seems, was more than legal. He was the kind of man for whom the network represented not merely a violation of law, but a personal affront to the entire system of order and hierarchy he'd built his life around. A system the war had dismantled, and that he was spending his post-war years trying to rebuild. By 1877, he'd traced the Vawses farm through a chain of reasoning and inquiry that can't be fully reconstructed. What he expected to find there isn't known. What he found during his years of ownership, between 1877 and 1879, isn't known either. The farm was quiet, the well sealed, the house deteriorating. Then came the fire. Fires in rural Virginia in 1879 weren't inherently suspicious, but a fire that destroyed a stone house, one that had stood since the 1680s, was more unusual. Stone houses don't burn the way wooden ones do. What burns is everything inside: floors, ceilings, furniture, papers, books, the accumulated physical record of nearly 2 centuries of a family's presence on the land. All of it ash. The well survived. The room below survived. But the connection between the room and the records that might have explained it was severed. Cornelius Dabney had purchased the property in 1877. The fire came in 1879. By then, the document from the tin cup, the list of names, was no longer there. It had disappeared sometime between 1871 and 1879. No one has ever established when it was taken or by whom. What remained were the names themselves, not on paper, but in memory. And memory, as anyone who's spent time with it knows, is both more durable and more mutable than paper. Louisa Vawses wasn't on the farm in 1871. She'd married in 1865 and was living 40 miles away when the workmen came. But she'd known about the room since she was 17. Known, in fact, more than her journal revealed. There were pages she'd carefully cut out, removing them without disturbing the binding. The cuts are still visible in the journal that eventually came to light. Whatever she wrote on those pages is gone. The journal itself was plain, a bookkeeper's ledger she'd repurposed. Early entries were what you'd expect: observations about weather, notes about the garden, accounts of church services. There was a period when she tracked a young man from the Cabell family, noting his visits and whether he'd spoken to her father, until that thread stopped abruptly in early 1858, as if she'd decided some narratives were better left unwritten. What remained after the cut pages were gone was still substantial. Years of entries covering the war, her marriage, her early years in Rockbridge County, the births of her children. But the gap was visible, not just in the missing leaves, but in the texture of the writing around it, measured, deliberately unremarkable. The writing of someone who'd decided consciously what to leave in and what to leave out. The cut entries covered approximately 14 months, from autumn 1858 through the end of 1859. The months after Trent's arrest, when the network went quiet and the route north closed. Whatever was happening in the room below during that period was happening without the usual movement of the chain above. Louisa lived until 1903. She outlived her husband and 2 of her 4 children. She never returned to the Vawses farm after her marriage, and in surviving letters from her later life, she never mentioned it directly. The only exception was a letter to her daughter about the fire, the one with the strange closing about hoping the trouble might now be allowed to rest. Her daughter, who'd never known the farm, kept the letter among her own papers without thinking much about it. It was just a letter from her mother, and for a long time, that was where the trail ended. Buried under a fire, a land transfer, and a carefully edited courthouse ledger. But the trail might have ended there, permanently, if not for a woman named Prudence Farley. Prudence was the granddaughter of Crockett Farley, the gristmill owner 2 miles south of the Vawses Hollow. Crockett had died in 1883, leaving behind a box of personal papers that sat in the family attic for 40 years. In 1921, Prudence, cleaning out after her parents' deaths, opened it and found what was inside. Ledgers, correspondence about grain prices, a deed, several letters from relatives in Tennessee, and one thing she didn't expect: a sealed envelope in her grandfather's handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, with instructions on the outside, "Do not open until I am gone." Crockett had been dead for 38 years. Prudence opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered on both sides in her grandfather's cramped hand. Dated July 1868, it described, in the methodical way of a man who'd spent his life keeping accounts, what Crockett had known about the Vawses farm and the room beneath the well. He'd known more than a neighbor 2 miles away might be expected to know. He'd known because he'd been part of it. Not as a station on the route. His mill was too visible. But as a supplier and a watcher. He'd provided lamp oil. Blankets bought in small quantities over several years, never enough at once to attract notice. He'd watched the road for investigators and sent word when they were coming. But the letter described something else as well. Something Crockett had seen on a specific night in September 1859, 14 months after Trent's arrest, when the investigation appeared to have died down and the network was cautiously resuming operations. He'd been returning from his mill late, walking his horse in the dark, when he saw lights at the Vawses farm that shouldn't have been there. 2 lanterns at the barn and the well, the signal he recognized from legitimate visits. But there was a third light, appearing and disappearing as someone went up and down the well shaft. He stopped on the road and watched. Over about an hour and a half, the third light went down and came up 11 times. He didn't approach. He went home, went to bed, and said nothing to anyone. But he counted 11, and he wrote that number down in 1868, 9 years later, with the care of someone who understood that what he'd seen was a data point in a larger account. 11 trips. Each took about 8 or 9 minutes. The rope and board seat could carry 1 person at a time. Not all those trips were people going down. Some were supplies, some were rigging. But some represented human beings being lowered 30 feet into the earth on a September night. The most remarkable part was the final paragraph. On his next visit to the Vawses farm, 3 weeks later, Crockett found Nathaniel in the yard near the well, not cleaning but listening. Leaning over the opening, running his hands along the stones. Nathaniel said he'd thought he heard something. Something like a voice, he said, but probably just the wind. Crockett didn't ask more. But walking back to the mill, he found himself thinking about the September night, the 11 trips, and whether all the people who'd gone down had come back up. He never asked. He wrote the question down instead, sealed it in an envelope, and left it for someone else to find. When Prudence read the paper in 1921, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then she put it back in the attic and said nothing. But she'd read it. She'd done the arithmetic. 6 years later, in 1927, she wrote to a history professor at a small college in Roanoke. A man named Elbert Hoig, who was researching what was then beginning to be called the Underground Railroad. She described her grandfather's letter in general terms and asked if he knew of any documented routes through the hill country and whether the Vawses farm appeared in his research. Hoag wrote back within a week. He knew the Vawses farm, not from living memory, but from 2 sources he hadn't been able to reconcile until her letter arrived. The first was a brief account published in a Pennsylvania Quaker newsletter in 1864, written by a man describing himself as having traveled through the mountain country before the war. It was fragmentary and deliberately vague, but it described a farm in a hollow, a well, a descent into the earth, and a room, not a cave, where he found 6 other people waiting. 7 people in the room below the Vawses well at the same time. The timeline suggested 1857 or early 1858. The second source was a collection of notes among the papers of Caleb Drummond, the Lynchburg Quaker merchant who'd entangled Trent in the network. Drummond had died in 1869, and his papers had sat in a trunk in a Quaker meeting in Philadelphia for half a century before being cataloged. In those notes, partly in English, partly in shorthand, were references to a station Drummond called the Stone Bottom, and a specific entry, Stone Bottom holding 7. Then, a week later, Stone Bottom, no word, route north closed, the arrest, June 1858. Here was what no one had ever established. What happened to those 7 people when the route north closed? They couldn't go north, couldn't go back south without enormous risk, couldn't emerge in daylight. They were stranded in a room built for days, not weeks. Hoag found no record of them reaching the Free States. No record of arrests, either. No documentation of a group of escaped enslaved people captured in the hill country in that period. He found nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Prudence went back to her grandfather's letter and read the final paragraph again, Nathaniel at the well. 3 weeks after the September night. Something like a voice. Probably just the wind. The September night was 15 months after the road closed. And yet on that night, someone was at the well with a lantern, going up and down 11 times. What Crockett had seen wasn't people being lowered into the room. It was people being brought up. If someone was being brought up 15 months later, what condition were they in? Were they alive? Were all of them alive? How many survived 15 months in a room designed for days? And if some didn't? If the room had become something other than a refuge, what did Nathaniel do with them? There was one detail Prudence had initially passed over. Crockett had mentioned that the area north of the well, between the well and the ridge, had been replanted with grass around 1860. He'd noted it as slightly odd at the time, something he'd filed away without knowing what to do with it. The grass was thicker there, he wrote. Thicker and darker than the rest of the yard. Nathaniel said he'd done some grading work. What Prudence thought when she read that detail isn't recorded. But she'd been a schoolteacher for 30 years. She was accustomed to following a chain of reasoning to its conclusion, even when it was difficult. She wrote back to Hogue and asked what he thought it meant. Hogue's response took 2 weeks. It was shorter than his first letter, a single page, measured and careful. He believed the Vawses farm had been an important station, and that the events of 1858 likely created an extremely difficult situation for everyone involved, including those sheltering below. He wrote that he'd like to visit the property and examine the area north of the well. He never made the visit. He died of pneumonia in February 1928, 4 months after writing the letter. Prudence lived until 1941. She gave Hogue's letters and her grandfather's envelope to a niece with instructions to put them in a safe place. The niece, who never quite understood what the papers contained, put them in a box of family documents. That box eventually made its way to an archive at a small historical society in central Virginia, where it was cataloged without particular attention and filed away. The farm itself is still there. The land changed hands several times. The barn eventually fell. The well was sealed, stone and mortar, as Silas Poor had paid for. The area north of the well, where the grass grew thicker after 1860, is now overgrown with cedar and sumac, as abandoned Virginia ground tends to do. The limestone below has never been formally surveyed. The room, 30 feet below the surface, accessible only through the shaft above, has never been officially documented or examined. The sealed well still sits in what used to be the yard, and the list of names from the tin cup, the list written in 2 hands, started decades before the war and added to over years of use. That list is gone, removed before the fire, taken by someone who understood what it meant and what it could prove, and what it was better, for certain purposes, to make disappear. Whether it was Cornelius Dabney who took it, or someone working for or against him, whether the names were destroyed or merely hidden, or whether they still exist somewhere, folded inside a book, in a box, in an envelope, isn't known. What is known is that those names were real. The people they belonged to were real. They made a descent into the earth of Virginia in the years before the war and trusted a stone room, a rope, and a Welsh farmer's family to keep them safe until the road north opened again. The road didn't open in time for all of them, and the ground north of the well is very flat, and the grass there, even now, grows a little thicker than anywhere else in the hollow. There's a particular silence around stories like this one. Not the silence of things never known, but of things known by too many people to be entirely forgotten, and by too few to become part of the official record. The Vawses farm history was never completely secret. Too many people touched it: the workmen, Silas Poor, Edmund Caskey, Cornelius Dabney, Crockett Farley, Louisa Vawses, who cut pages from her journal and spent the rest of her life not talking about them. All of them knew something. None knew everything. And none were in a position. Given the political climate of Reconstruction Virginia, the ongoing danger connected to Trent's network, the legal jeopardy attached to certain kinds of knowledge, to say what they knew in a form that would survive. The erasure wasn't the work of one person. It was the accumulated result of dozens of choices made by people navigating an impossibly complicated moral and legal landscape, in a time when the wrong information in the wrong hands could destroy a family. Nathaniel Vawses died in 1873, 2 years after the well was drained and sealed, of a winter fever, according to the family Bible. He was 68. What he'd done over those years that mattered was build something. Not just the room, which was older than him, but the system around it. The contacts, the timing, the supply chain of blankets and lamp oil and preserved food, the careful watching of the road, the management of a secret that grew larger and more dangerous with every passing year. And when the route closed and the people below were stranded, whatever he decided in those weeks and months, whatever the thick grass to the north eventually covered, those decisions were made by a man operating in the dark in every sense, with no good options, no authority to appeal to, and no way to ask for help without destroying everything he'd built. We don't know what he decided. We can only see the outcome: the sealed well, the altered ground, the missing pages, the paper removed from the tin cup before the fire. What we can say, based on the partial and fragmentary evidence we have, is that the room below the Vawses well was built in service of a purpose that was an act of sustained and deliberate human care. Someone thought about what a person would need to survive in the dark. Someone counted the days, calculated the oil, folded the blankets, cut the ventilation shaft. Someone kept a list of names. The names are gone, but the room is still there, below the sealed well, in the hollow between the ridges. The timbers are older now, the plank floor likely collapsed, the limestone working at the mortar for a century and a half, but the natural fissure, the Welsh miner, found in 1690, doesn't care about time. It's still there, cool and dark, running north to south beneath the Virginia earth. And on the wall of that room, in what appears to be a transcription of something her father told her, Louisa mentions marks scratched into the limestone by the people who waited there. Marks, lines. The kind you make to count the days. She doesn't say how many lines there are. She doesn't say whether anyone ever finished counting them. That's where the record ends. 30 feet underground, in the dark of the Virginia hill country, with a lamp that has oil enough for several more days, blankets folded on a plank floor, and marks on the limestone wall that no one has counted in a very long time. This mystery shows us something about the limits of what official records can hold, and what they choose to discard, about the gap between what happened and what was allowed to be remembered. The Vawses farm didn't disappear because it was unimportant. It disappeared because it was important in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable in a period when comfort and power were closely aligned. What do you think happened in that room in the summer of 1858? Do you believe all the names on that list eventually made it north? Or does the thick grass and the silence tell a different story? Leave your comment below. We read every one. And if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in those last sections, share it with someone who loves history and doesn't mind losing a little sleep over it. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and join us for the next story, because there are more rooms below the surface of American history than any official record will ever admit. and we intend to find them.